Hey everyone, Brian here, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're going to be unpacking some really interesting stuff today, all about caffeine. And this one is actually curated especially for the folks over at Detox Health's YouTube channel.
Oh, awesome.
You guys should definitely check them out. If you're
Yeah.
into learning more about health and wellness,
Mm-hmm.
they've got tons of great info and delicious, healthy recipes. So just hit that subscribe button
Yes, please.
so you don't miss out on any of that good stuff. All right, so let's dive in. Caffeine. Right.
Oh, yeah.
So this is something that I think we can all relate to in one way or another.
Absolutely. It's practically woven into the fabric of our lives these days. It's not just in your morning coffee or your afternoon tea.
Right.
You find it in chocolate,
Oh, yeah.
energy drinks, even some surprising places like certain ice creams, chewing gum, and even medications.
Wow. So it really is everywhere.
It really is.
Like, it's kind of amazing how pervasive it is.
Yeah.
But let's take a step back for a second and talk about, how it actually works.
Yeah.
Like, how does caffeine actually give us that energy boost? What's the science behind it?
So basically, our brains have these receptors called adenosine receptors, and when adenosine binds to these receptors, we start feeling tired, right?
Oh, the sense?
But caffeine, it's like it comes in and blocks that adenosine from binding.
Whoa.
So it's kind of like hitting the pause button on tiredness.
Oh, so it's tricking our brains.
Exactly. It's tricking our brains into thinking we're not tired.
Like that.
And not only that, but caffeine also nudges other neurotransmitters like dopamine and adrenaline, which are the ones responsible for those feelings of motivation that get up and go energy.
Wow. So it's really messing with like a lot of different brain chemicals.
It is.
It's pretty powerful stuff when you think about it that way.
Mhm.
So is all of this ultimately a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Moderate caffeine consumption can actually have some surprising health benefits. Yeah, for example, there are studies that show moderate caffeine intake can actually improve physical performance.
Oh,
There was this one study with cyclists, and they found that caffeine led to a performance improvement of up to 1.7%.
1.7%. That's like a secret weapon almost.
Yeah.
I've also heard that caffeine might be good for, preventing certain diseases. Is there any truth to that?
There's definitely some really promising research out there. Some studies suggest that caffeine could play a role in reducing the risk of developing certain cancers, heart disease, even type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
There's also evidence linking coffee consumption specifically with a lower risk of depression. And here's a really fascinating tidbit. Some research suggests that caffeine, especially from coffee, might be linked to a reduced risk of Alzheimer's disease.
That's incredible. So our daily cup of coffee could be doing more than just waking us up.
Yeah.
Could be protecting our brains in the long run.
It's a possibility. It could be related to its ability to boost blood flow to the brain. But of course, more research is needed to confirm these findings.
Okay, that's really interesting. But let's be real. There's got to be a downside to all this, right?
Right.
What happens if we have too much caffeine?
Yeah. Too much of a good thing, as they say. Right.
Exactly.
We talked about caffeine boosting blood flow to the brain.
Yeah.
Well, that increased blood flow can trigger headaches or migraines in some people.
Ah, so that's why I get a headache after my second cup of coffee.
Exactly.
It all makes sense now.
And high caffeine intake can be risky, especially for those with pre-existing conditions like high blood pressure. So moderation is definitely key.
Right.
It's essential to really be mindful of your own body's signals.
Okay, so speaking of being mindful, what about the timing of our caffeine intake? Does it matter when we get our caffeine fix?
Timing is really important, especially when it comes to sleep. Experts recommend avoiding caffeine at least 8 hours and 48 minutes before bed.
8 hours and 48 minutes, that's very specific.
Yeah, they really studied this.
Okay.
So caffeine can stay in our system for a while, so we have to think about that timing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I want to talk about a group that needs to be extra careful with caffeine. Pregnant women.
Yes.
Because obviously what they consume affects the baby too.
Absolutely. Caffeine can actually easily cross the placenta and impact fetal development.
Oh.
And there was a study that analyzed 37 other studies,
Okay.
and they found that 32 of them showed an increased risk of adverse pregnancy outcomes with caffeine consumption, like gestational diabetes, preeclampsia.
That's concerning. What kinds of risks are we talking about here?
Well, we're talking potential complications like restricted fetal growth,
Okay.
and in more serious cases, even miscarriages, stillbirths, and low birth weight.
Wow, that's really serious.
It really is. It's not something to take lightly.
Definitely not. And it's not just during pregnancy, right? I've also heard that caffeine can affect breastfeeding infants.
You're right. It can pass through breast milk And for babies that are sensitive, it can lead to withdrawal symptoms.
Withdrawal symptoms in babies? I never
Yeah,
would have thought of that. That's really important information for new moms.
it is.
Okay, so let's talk about energy drinks. They seem to be super popular, especially with younger people. What's the deal with them?
Yeah, they're marketed as a quick way to get energy,
Yeah.
but they have some concerns.
Like what?
Well, the biggest one is their extremely high caffeine content.
Well,
They often combine that with other stimulants. And this potent cocktail can lead to health problems,
yeah.
particularly for children and teens.
I've heard that they're especially bad for young people. Is that true?
There is some truth to that. The American Academy of Pediatrics actually advises against energy drinks for children and teens
Wow.
because of their potential negative impact on their cardiovascular and neurological health.
So that's a pretty serious warning. What about the FDA? Do they have any kind of regulations on energy drinks?
The FDA actually doesn't have specific regulations for energy drinks beyond just the general safety guidelines that apply to all food and beverages.
Oh, okay.
So it's really important for consumers to be aware of those risks and make informed choices.
All right, so buyer beware.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to debunk a common myth that I think a lot of people believe. Decaf doesn't actually mean caffeine-free, right?
Right. A lot of people think decaf equals zero caffeine.
Yeah.
But that's not actually true. Decaffeinated beverages still contain small amounts of caffeine.
Oh, okay.
It's usually not a significant amount, but it's something to keep in mind, especially if you're sensitive to caffeine.
So it's more like low calf.
Yeah, you could think about it that way.
Interesting.
Hmm.
What about those decaf coffees that claim to have zero caffeine?
Well, the decaffeination process usually removes about 97% of the caffeine.
Okay.
So there are almost always going to be trace amounts left behind.
Oh, that makes sense. So it's really all about knowing your own sensitivity and kind of making choices that work for you?
Exactly. And here's another thing. Individual tolerance to caffeine varies widely.
So you're saying what might be like a normal amount for one person could be way too much for someone else?
Exactly. Our genes actually play a big role in how we metabolize and react to caffeine.
Okay.
We have a specific gene called CYP1A2 that acts like a caffeine processing plant in our bodies.
Ugh.
And some people have a high-speed processing plant, meaning they metabolize caffeine very quickly,
Okay.
but other people have a much slower version.
So that's why some people can drink coffee before bed and sleep like a baby,
Yes,
and others are like staring at the ceiling all night.
exactly. It's a perfect example of how our genes can personalize our experiences with caffeine. It really reinforces that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
So with all this talk about individual tolerance, what's the bottom line? How much caffeine is considered too much?
The FDA actually recommends a daily caffeine limit of 400 milligrams for most adults.
Okay.
To give you like a visual, that's roughly 2 to 3 12-ounce cups of coffee.
Gotcha. So are you saying it's really all about listening to our bodies and knowing our own individual limits?
Exactly. Too much varies greatly from person to person. Yeah. It's influenced by things like your body weight, medications, and of course, your individual sensitivity. It's all about paying attention to your body and knowing your limits.
Great advice.
Yeah.
I think it's safe to say that caffeine is a lot more complex than we might realize.
It really is. And honestly, we've only scratched the surface here.
Well, I'm already looking at my morning coffee in a whole new light, that's for sure.
Good.
And that's it for part 1 of our caffeine deep dive. Stay tuned because we'll be back with even more caffeine insights. It's fascinating how much our genes can affect, how we handle caffeine. It's like we each have our own little personal caffeine journey.
That's a great way to put it. And those journeys can be full of surprises. Did you know for some people it can take as little as 2 hours to metabolize half the caffeine they've consumed?
2 hours. That's incredibly fast.
Yeah.
So for other people, it takes much longer.
Exactly. For some, it can take over 12. It all comes down to those genetic variations we talked about earlier. You know that CYP1A2 enzyme? Think of it like a caffeine processing plant in your body. Some have a high-speed plant while others have a slower one.
So that explains why some people can have an espresso after dinner and sleep like a log.
Uh-huh.
And others are wide awake all night.
Exactly. It's a perfect example of how these tiny genetic variations can really impact our everyday experiences with caffeine.
Yeah.
It really reinforces that there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
It's all about finding what works for your body. So that kind of brings up a question. What happens when we have too much caffeine?
Right.
Are we talking just a little jitteriness, or are there more serious risks?
That's a really good question. And it's important to remember that caffeine is a stimulant. So just like with any stimulant, too much can lead to some not so fun side effects. We talked about headaches, but overdoing it on caffeine can also cause anxiety, restlessness, insomnia. You might feel kind of wired and anxious instead of that energized and focused feeling.
Yeah.
Some people experience nausea, upset stomach, or even heart palpitations. In very rare cases, extreme doses can even lead to seizures.
Oh, wow, that sounds serious. I guess it's a good reminder that even though caffeine is like everywhere and so readily available,
Yeah.
it's still a powerful substance that we should treat with respect.
Absolutely. And part of treating it with respect is knowing your limits. We talked about that FDA recommendation of 400 milligrams per day for most adults.
Hmm.
There's another guideline that's worth knowing about. The European Food Safety Authority, or EFSA, advises healthy adults to limit their intake to 200 milligrams per single drink.
Oh, so that's like setting a limit per serving.
Exactly.
That's really interesting. Makes a lot of sense, especially when you think about like energy drinks that pack a ton of caffeine into just one serving.
Exactly. Even if you're staying under that 400 milligram daily limit,
Right.
you could still be going over that recommended amount per serving if you're, chugging down a huge energy drink.
Yeah.
Or a supersized coffee. That's a really good point. I think often we don't think about like the caffeine content of individual servings.
Right.
We just kind of think about the total throughout the day.
Yeah.
But you really do need to pay attention to like how much you're having at any given time.
It's all about pacing yourself and being mindful.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to those potential health benefits that we were talking about before.
Okay.
You mentioned that moderate caffeine consumption has been linked to like a reduced risk of certain diseases. But is that true for all sources of caffeine? Or is it mainly coffee we're talking about?
That's a great question. And it really kind of points to the complexity of caffeine research. While a lot of the research has focused on coffee,
Right.
you know, other sources like tea, for example,
Yeah.
have also shown some promising results.
So tea drinkers rejoice. Exactly. Tea, especially black and green tea, they contain quite a bit of caffeine. But they also have those antioxidants and other beneficial compounds. So it's not just about the caffeine.
Right.
It's about the whole package.
It seems like the type of coffee that we drink can also make a difference.
Yeah, definitely. For example, there are studies showing that filtered coffee is actually linked to lower rates of arterial disease and death compared to unfiltered coffee. So even the way you brew your coffee
Wow.
could have an impact.
That's really fascinating. It seems like there's always more to learn about caffeine and how it impacts us.
Absolutely. There's so much that we're constantly discovering about this seemingly simple substance.
It really makes you appreciate that morning cup of coffee, knowing all this.
Right.
It's like there's this whole symphony going on
It is.
in our brains and our bodies.
Mm.
Okay, I've got a confession. I'm kind of a bit of a caffeine fiend myself.
Oh, really?
I love my coffee.
Yeah.
And I'll admit, I sometimes push the limits of that 400 milligram daily recommendation.
You always seem so calm and collected.
That's the caffeine magic.
Yeah.
No, but in all seriousness, I do try to, be mindful of my intake, especially after learning about all the potential downsides.
Yeah, I think that's the key, right? It's not about demonizing caffeine.
Right.
It's about understanding its effects, both good and bad.
Yeah,
And then making choices that work for your individual needs and lifestyle.
exactly. And I think that's something we can all do, regardless of our genetics or how much we like caffeine. It's about taking control of your own health.
Well said. Speaking of health, we can't forget about one crucial area that caffeine affects: sleep.
Ah, sleep, the holy grail of well-being.
Yes.
And caffeine, the notorious sleep saboteur.
Uh-huh.
We know that caffeine can make it harder to fall asleep. But can it affect the quality of our sleep, even if we do manage to drift off?
Absolutely. Caffeine can reduce the amount of deep sleep that we get, which is, the most restorative sleep stage. So even if you're getting enough hours, you might not be feeling as rested.
Right.
If caffeine is interfering with your deep sleep,
So it's like caffeine is robbing us of that really restful sleep.
that's a great way to put it.
So no wonder we wake up feeling groggy, even after a full night's sleep.
Exactly. And, lack of deep sleep has been linked to all kinds of issues: mood swings, cognitive impairment, weakened immunity, and even increased risk of chronic diseases.
Wow, that's kind of scary. So our afternoon latte might be costing us more than just a few bucks.
Right.
It could be impacting our health
Exactly.
in ways we don't even realize.
Yeah. And it really underscores the importance of timing, That 8-hour and 48-minute rule.
Yeah.
It's really important even if you think caffeine doesn't affect your ability to fall asleep.
Right. So we need to be strategic with our caffeine intake. It's not just about avoiding it right before bed. It's about, like, throughout the day.
Yes.
Being aware of how much we're having and how that might affect our sleep later on.
If you're constantly topping up your caffeine levels throughout the day, it makes it harder to wind down when it's time for bed.
Yeah. So it's like a low-grade caffeine hangover, just lingering there,
I love that analogy.
messing with our sleep.
Now, are there any other hidden ways caffeine might be affecting us that we haven't talked about yet? Surprising things most people wouldn't even think about.
I'm actually curious to hear you think about that.
Well, remember when we were discussing adenosine and how it helps us feel sleepy?
Yeah.
Well, it turns out that adenosine might actually have other important roles in the body.
Really? Like what?
Well, there's some evidence that adenosine has anti-inflammatory properties.
Oh, interesting. So by blocking that with caffeine,
Yeah.
could we actually be messing with our body's natural defenses?
That's a possibility that researchers are looking into right now. We don't have all the answers,
Yeah.
but it's definitely something to consider.
I love how you're, like, connecting all these different pieces of the puzzle,
Mm-hmm.
and showing us that caffeine is not as simple as it seems.
Exactly. It's all about how the pieces fit together. And sometimes those pieces can surprise us. Even when we're trying to avoid caffeine, it can sneak into our diet in surprising ways.
Oh, really? I thought we had talked about, like, all the main culprits: coffee, tea, chocolate, energy drinks. What else is there?
Those are the obvious ones. But caffeine can be hiding in all sorts of things.
Like what?
Like some ice cream brands contain caffeine, certain chewing gums, even protein bars, yogurt. Some medications have caffeine in them.
Wow. I had no idea.
So you really do have to read those labels.
It's like a scavenger hunt.
It is. That's why it's so important to be informed about caffeine, Understand where it comes from and how it can affect you.
Yeah. Knowledge is power.
Exactly.
When it comes to caffeine, it's our secret weapon.
It is.
All right, so I think that's a great place to pause for a second.
Okay.
We've covered so much ground today. Everything from the molecular mechanisms of caffeine to, like, the benefits and the risks. It's been really eye-opening. What do you think is the most important thing to take away from our discussion?
I think the main thing to remember is that caffeine isn't inherently good or bad. It's a powerful substance. It can have positive and negative effects.
Right.
It all depends on how you use it and how your body responds.
I totally agree. It's about respecting caffeine's power and using it wisely. Yeah. Understanding your personal limits.
And remembering that everyone's caffeine journey is different. What works for one person might not work for you.
Yeah.
And that's perfectly fine.
It all comes back to personalized nutrition.
Exactly.
Right? There's no one-size-fits-all approach to caffeine, just like any other part of our diet.
We're all unique.
So next time you reach for your coffee or your energy drink, even a chocolate bar, take a moment to think about your own caffeine journey. What role does it play in your life? How does it make you feel? Are you using it in a way that actually supports your well-being?
Great questions to consider.
Well, we've covered a lot, but we're not done yet. We'll be right back after a quick break to discuss how caffeine specifically affects different parts of the body.
All right, so we're back and ready to get even deeper into this caffeine rabbit hole. Before the break, we were talking about these individual caffeine journeys. I want to get really specific. How does caffeine affect different parts of our body?
Okay, let's start with the control center, the brain. We've already talked about how caffeine blocks those adenosine receptors, leading to that increased alertness and focus. But it doesn't just stop there. Caffeine also influences other neurotransmitters, like dopamine and adrenaline, which are key for our mood, motivation, energy levels.
So it's like a multitasking brain booster.
Yeah, exactly. It tweaks these various pathways and creates that energized feeling.
So I imagine this can have, like, both good and bad effects, right?
Absolutely. On one hand, caffeine can, enhance cognitive function, make your reactions faster, even boost creativity.
Yeah.
But too much. You can end up with anxiety, the jitters, and trouble concentrating.
So it's all about finding that balance. It really is.
Like walking a tightrope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Between that mental sharpness and just getting overloaded. And the key to staying balanced is, knowing your limits. Pay attention to how your brain reacts to caffeine.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to another really important organ, the heart. How does caffeine affect our cardiovascular system?
Right. So a lot of people have heard that caffeine can raise your heart rate.
Yeah.
And it's true, caffeine's a stimulant, so it increases both your heart rate and your blood pressure.
Okay.
For most healthy adults, these effects are temporary and not really a big deal, but for people with heart conditions,
Right.
like high blood pressure or arrhythmias,
Yeah.
it can make those worse.
So definitely something to be careful about.
Yeah, be cautious.
You should talk to your doctor, right?
Absolutely, especially because caffeine can interact with certain medications.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Always good to check with your healthcare provider about that.
Okay. Good advice. Now let's talk about something we all need, sleep. We discussed earlier how caffeine can really mess with our sleep. But I'm curious about, how it works, the mechanisms behind that. How exactly does caffeine disrupt our sleep?
Okay, so caffeine's biggest weapon in that sleep war is that it can delay the release of melatonin. That's the hormone that controls our sleep-wake cycle, right?
Yeah.
So caffeine suppresses melatonin production, which makes you feel more alert even when your body wants to rest.
So it's basically tricking our brains into thinking it's still daytime.
Exactly. And this can lead to a domino effect on your sleep, less deep sleep, more waking up in the night,
Oh, yeah.
and feeling less rested in the morning.
So caffeine is waging war on our sleep.
That's one way to put it. The best way to win that war is to be smart about your caffeine intake. Don't drink it too close to bedtime. Be mindful of how much you're having in general.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the digestive system. How does caffeine affect our gut?
All right, so caffeine stimulates the production of gastric acid in our stomachs.
Okay.
That's the acidic fluid that helps break down food, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this can be a problem for people with GERD or peptic ulcers.
Oh, okay.
It can really aggravate those symptoms.
So if you have, heartburn or indigestion,
Yeah,
it might be best to cut back on the caffeine.
it could be helpful. Now, it's interesting. Caffeine can also act as a laxative.
Oh.
So if you're constipated,
Yeah.
that cup of coffee might help. But if you already have loose stools or diarrhea,
Right.
caffeine could make things worse.
So it can go both ways.
It really depends on the person.
Yeah, it seems like caffeine's effects on digestion are all over the place.
Very true. Another reminder that there's no one size fits all. It's about paying attention to your body and figuring out what works for you.
Absolutely. Okay, last but not least, let's talk about something I think a lot of people don't even realize is a thing. Caffeine withdrawal.
Yeah.
So what happens when we suddenly cut back on caffeine after having it regularly?
Caffeine withdrawal is definitely real,
Okay.
and it can have some unpleasant symptoms. Headaches, feeling tired, irritability, trouble concentrating. Some people even feel like they have the flu.
Wow, that sounds pretty awful.
Yeah, it is.
Really shows you how powerful caffeine is. So if you're thinking about reducing your caffeine intake, I guess it's best to wean yourself off slowly.
Yeah.
Don't go cold turkey.
Exactly. That can help minimize those withdrawal symptoms
Yeah.
and make the transition a lot easier.
Well, we've covered a ton of ground today.
Mm.
Everything about caffeine, from the tiny molecules to the bigger picture of its benefits and risks. What are your final thoughts for our listeners?
My hope is that our listeners feel empowered to make their own choices about their caffeine habits. What works for one person might not work for another, and that's okay. Listen to your body, find what feels best for you.
I love that. It's been such an interesting conversation. And don't forget, if you want to learn more about health and nutrition, make sure to check out and subscribe to the Detox Health YouTube channel. They've got tons of great info, including amazing healthy recipes.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive.